I do want you to jerk off in front of us right now.
Have we gotten worse at writing? It has always been said that if you want to become a better writer, you should read a lot, not just for inspiration, but also as a reference for how to write properly. And with the modern decline in reading, it would be easy to make the case that, in general, writers are less skilled than they used to be. But is that really true? I mean, when we look at self-publishing, it certainly seems as if the authors and books they write have declined in quality. Even if you are among the majority who no longer reads regularly, you might still catch lines of dialogue from TV shows or movies which are just poorly written, or entire plots which make absolutely no fucking sense or seemingly have no soul or passion. We might look back at the classics and lament the fact that we no longer have any classics anymore. Everything that comes out nowadays just seems to be a shadow of what it used to be. I mean, in the past, there used to be so many movies with original stories and ideas coming out of Hollywood alone, and now it just seems like all that comes out in theaters is the tired Marvel sludge we've been fed for the last decade. And if I was a cynic, I'd probably be able to convince you and myself that, in fact, we have gotten worse, and that writers are just bad nowadays. Maybe I could even add in a bit of subtly discriminatory biases to play on our inherent human need to categorize things and blame them on that which makes us uncomfortable. Point to those things as the root cause for a perceived decline in what we enjoy and consume. Yes, it's definitely the wokeism that's been ruining Hollywood, and not the corporate greed cutting corners and forcing writers to only write rough drafts for reboot after reboot because it is a safe bet on their marketing team and investors to cash in on. It's definitely all of the diversity hires that may or may not exist in a production, and not the cynical nitpicking from people who have failed to address their internal biases. I think making that argument would be incredibly easy, and I'd probably get quite a few high school boys to agree with me. Considering that people who watch video essays are predominantly young men and boys, boiling down this concept into something like that would get plenty of people thinking they'd learned something while I've really done nothing but complain and bullshit my way through a video. Don't get me wrong, this video isn't really any less of an opinion than one you might find from another YouTuber. I just don't intend to pretend like I have all the answers, or that gay people existing in fiction is somehow causal to bad writing.
Alright, no more uniforms. From now on, we're all going naked.
In fact, I don't think writers have gotten better or worse, all things considered. Yes, we might look at things such as books, knowing that reading a lot can make you better at writing, and acknowledge that people as a whole don't read that much anymore. But what I think a lot of people don't understand about writing a story is that the unique benefits of reading a lot of books are not that you become a better storyteller, but that you have better prose. Prose is basically how you word things in a story, if you're unfamiliar. And I'm not saying that reading won't make you a better storyteller either. I'm saying that reading is not the only way to become a better storyteller. After all, many writers are inspired to write not because of something they read, but because of something they watched or listened to. Storytelling and being technically skilled at writing are two very different things. Someone can have all of the flowery purple prose in the world, but if the story is not interesting, then the story is not interesting. It's like watching a movie where the fight scenes are really good, but the dialogue is clunky and the plot makes no sense, and the motivations for every character to fight in the first place are incredibly contrived or just non-existent. Maybe some people would read good prose to enjoy it on its own, but I doubt anyone who reads a book with only good prose and a terrible story would end up considering the book itself to be good. But even beyond books themselves, it seems we get endless amounts of corporate slop to consume month after month and week after week, especially in the West, where it seems anything Hollywood pumps out these days is incredibly boring or lacks any artistic integrity. But the problem with that perception is that we have both a recency bias and a negativity bias. If you are uncomfortable with gay people, for example, you will view a story's writing more negatively and claim that you are seeing it everywhere, when in reality, those groups of people are still underrepresented in media. With our recency bias, we also tend to overemphasize the importance of shows or stories we have experienced recently, even if those same stories might be forgotten within 2 to 3 years. But I'm also not here to call everyone racist or homophobic either. Sometimes all we want is a well-written character. In fact, I think most people just want a well-written character and a well-represented character to thrive. And while I feel that negativity bias is disproportionately applied to minority characters in fictions, especially gay or trans people, I also think there's a great deal of people who only have those high expectations because they belong to one or more of those groups. And I also don't think it's always fair to hide behind the shield of, well, you only hate this because you're a bigot. I think sometimes writers will use that as a crutch instead of confronting their ego and taking criticism. Sometimes, though, both things can be true. A writer was not good at writing, but also the audience blew their hatred out of proportion due to pre-existing internal biases. This is venturing into a completely different topic, though, which I have already spoken about. Link is right on screen now if you want to check it out. Tangents and politics aside, have we actually gotten worse at writing, or is this all just an illusion caused by an oversaturation of criticism and a corporate stranglehold on Hollywood media? I think it's the latter, personally. I think a lot of the time, we tend to confuse a well-written story with a story that fits my niche tastes. Even if I personally do not like a show or book, I can still acknowledge the skill and merits behind it. Just because a story does not resonate with me strongly doesn't mean that anything with the writing was necessarily done wrong. I also think there are more stories now than ever which fit into specific niches. Content creation has led to the rise of large niche communities who enjoy content that is specifically tailored to their tastes. Oh, you don't like a certain YouTuber that you're watching? Just click off. Wait, no. And within that sea of niche storytelling, we might believe that because we do not enjoy all of it, or find it absolutely fantastic as other people do, that the writing must be worse overall, and that our generation is failing. And in reality, it's just that the volume of content has increased, but the general quality has likely stayed the same. Content is more accessible now than it ever has been, and that's true for both good and bad content alike. Criticism is also a lot more visible than it ever has been, because any Joe Schmo on the internet can have an opinion on something which came out recently. There are no qualifications to being a critic, and no matter what, you will always have at least one person who didn't like the show that you liked. And that aforementioned criticism is a lot more visible when it's about something a larger majority of people already dislike. I'll make She-Hulk my example. I never watched it, never cared about She-Hulk, in fact. In any other era of humanity, I would not know the first thing about She-Hulk, or if the show was good or bad unless I had actually watched it for myself or bothered to read any of the reviews. But according to literally every critic on the fucking internet, apparently, She-Hulk is the worst piece of human garbage to ever hit television screens. At least until the next punching bag comes out. Velma. And I'm not here to dispute whether or not She-Hulk is poorly written. I haven't watched the show, and I have not had an interest in watching anything from Marvel in a long time. So I do what any normal, sane person would do. I just watch something else. Maybe She-Hulk is bad, but does that mean writers in general are worse than they were in the good old days of writing? I don't think so. I think people who hold this opinion are too focused on surrounding themselves with stories that they don't like because they are addicted to hate watching things. Instead of just saying, it's not my cup of tea, and finding something they do enjoy instead, they're too preoccupied with trying to spin a narrative of why everything's bad now. And yes, you can do both. I'm not saying we can never complain about movies. After all, I enjoy hate watching every now and again. Being half Italian, it is my birthright to openly and passionately argue about meaningless topics, hand gestures, and all. But let's at least acknowledge when we love to hate something and stop pretending like we don't care about the things we dislike. You either don't care or you hate something. Those are two very different things, and yes, they are mutually exclusive. Either way, does any of this mean writing has become worse? It certainly feels like there were better shows and stories from when we grew up. Heck, there seems to be a lot more classics from even before we were born. So are people getting worse at telling stories? Not really. After all, we tend to forget the things which we don't like or care about. For every old classic, there are likely mountains of bad, mediocre, or slightly above average but forgettable stories that we don't think about. And for every one of those forgotten movies or shows, there will always be some sort of nerd on the internet with a highly niche taste who will reach back into the past, drag up one of these obscure movies, and make a video essay as to why that slightly above average story is actually a hidden gem that deserves more praise. And I'm not even saying that those people are wrong for doing that. I'm saying that what we consider good or bad writing can change with the times. And it can change with how we perceive the world around us. A random nerd on the internet can convince quite a lot of people that certain movies are incredibly underrated and tragically undersold in their time. They can also convince people that the story we all enjoyed kinda sucked in hindsight. The other thing to consider is that writers have a lot more mediums to tell their stories than they did back then. With the rise of the internet and streaming services, not only are writers displaced into different industries, but the possibilities of telling a story have also expanded. The medium can decide the structure, pacing, and general concept of a story. For example, in the time of paid programming, every TV show was written with weekly episodes in mind. It gave rise to episodic storytelling, which allowed writers to make a show for as long as the company would renew their series, all the while retaining and inviting new watchers to the show. With paid programming, viewers didn't really have a choice when it came to what they watched. If you missed an episode of something, you were going to miss it until they re-aired it, or until the DVDs came out, or VHSs if you're really that old. Episodic writing solved this issue by making it so that it wasn't mandatory to watch every prior episode to understand what was going on or enjoy the episode by itself. And if you've been paying attention to a lot of the new stories coming out, episodic storytelling is not as common as it used to be. And if you've noticed that episodic storytelling is not as common as it used to be, then you're correct. And that's because the medium for which writers can convey their stories has changed, and the possibilities for plot lines have opened up. Now writers can make their shows with binge watching in mind. With the rise of streaming services, stories now have the ability to have more plot lines and rewatchable episodes. They know how to front load the first season of their show so that they get renewed for second or third seasons. Although, if you're a Netflix series, you're probably, maybe, abso-fucking-lutely gonna only get 2 seasons at best. Tangents and corporate greed aside, this is just one example of how the medium through which we tell our stories can transform how the story is told. Let's say someone really loves the style of episodic storytelling, but nowadays it doesn't seem like shows use episodic storytelling anymore. And if they do, they inevitably get rid of it to adopt a more plot-oriented style. If you are that person who enjoys episodic storytelling, you might have the perception that writing for shows has gotten worse simply because shows which are coming out now are not written for your niche interests, and they're written a lot differently than they were when you were growing up. And as I said before, not only have the mediums through which writers tell their stories changed, but they have also expanded. Web novels, web comics, YouTube miniseries, video games, cinematic universes, even independent animated series which are solely distributed and monetized through personal YouTube channels. We've seen the rise of, in my opinion, the best genre of horror in analog horror on YouTube. And yes, there are some bad analog horror ones that are just silly, but that's what happens with an oversaturation of a particular genre. We've also seen shows like Hell of a Boss and, more recently, Amazing Digital Circus absolutely smash the animation community and garner hundreds of millions of views. We've also seen a rise in international media consumption. Anime and manga alone has skyrocketed in popularity across the world, and there are Chinese as well as Korean stories which are starting to do the same. The point is, people are finding good stories. We just don't always find those stories in the same places we used to find them, and writers are not growing up to write in the same ways that we used to write. I think a lot of people who have the impression that we're just worse at writing nowadays are only looking at something which is different and calling it worse. I mean, the movie Psycho, a Hitchcock classic, was highly criticized because it was scandalous enough to show a toilet in one of the scenes, along with hints of a woman showering. Ooh. And I'm sure there are plenty of movies with progressive politics today which are routinely panned by a conservative or neutral majority, nitpicking the shit out of it. And let's be fair to the conservatives here. There are a lot of movies which people want to drag up from the past and claim that it is harmful or didn't age well. I dislike revisionist history as much as the next person, but I don't think it's all that harmful. Yes, a lot of the movies that we watched in the 2000s were pretty casually racist, especially comedy movies. One example of a movie I watched recently was the Rush Hour trilogy. A lot of the humor is heavily based on racial bigotry, with Chris Tucker's character acting as the biggest bigot for laughs.
Do you understand the words that are coming out of my mouth?
And, you know, I gotta say, even though some of the jokes were cringeworthy, I think Chris Tucker's delivery and portrayal of an idiot LAPD cop still lands. Yes, a movie like Rush Hour is a product of its time, but it's hardly problematic. After all, the fact that we can see how poorly some of the jokes aged in the first place is a sign that we've grown as a society to be more inclusive than we are or were in the late 90s and early to mid 2000s. I'm not here to long for the days of Rush Hour comedy to be brought back. In fact, I would definitely like it if that type of humor stayed in the 2000s where it belongs. However, I also don't think it's right to call it bad writing or view it as problematic when it's nothing more than a product of its time. Then again, I am a random white guy on the internet, and when it comes to topics about race and racism, I think there's quite a few of those perspectives constantly being shouted over other people. And none of the race jokes in Rush Hour were aimed at white people either, so it's not like I have any skin in the game or discomfort with how the dialogue was. I can review this trilogy and say that the plot was often pretty convoluted and the romance didn't really matter all that much, but overall I still enjoyed the movies, so I think that counts for something. Rush Hour was a fun movie, and it has some good moments in its writing, but it also has some bad moments too. I personally think more people should analyze movies like instead of trying to make a statement about how good or bad the writing is from an objective standpoint, perhaps we should acknowledge that a lot of our review is purely subjective, and the quality we perceive can change with time, even though the thing we are perceiving has not changed at all. I keep coming back to this concept of art being subjective and the social opinion of art always changing. What we consider to be good writing in one story might be considered bad writing in the past or future for the exact same story. Human beings, on top of having a negativity bias and a recency bias, also have a tendency to pick up patterns which might not even exist. We can recognize faces in clouds or create words from randomly generated letters. We create conspiracy theories and entire stories to explain something which basically boils down to a coincidence. We also tend to ignore and forget all of the things that miss the mark for us. For example, when you have a chance encounter with someone that you haven't seen in a long time, we think, what are the odds? All the while ignoring all of the other people in that place who did not know us or reunite with us. Perhaps the odds are something low, but the amount of times that probability is being tested could be high, and it could be ever present. So when we happen to see things that we don't like, our negativity bias makes us focus on it, and our tendency to perceive patterns where there are none can lead us to believe that there is some sort of trend or conspiracy behind writing rooms. In other words, if you feel like there's too much forced diversity in stories these days, the easiest way to overcome that problem is to no longer view any diversity as something negative. Spider-Verse is an immaculately crafted story. The first movie innovated on animation in a way that studios are only just now starting to catch up with. The story catapulted Miles Morales' character into the mainstream, and in my opinion, it's perfected his origin. When it comes to writing, I think we can all agree Spider-Verse is filled with good writing. And yet, somehow, we still have people trying to nitpick and complain about it. And yes, there are no perfect movies, nor is there any story which everyone will find good. But I'd also like to bring into question why certain critics feel the need to dislike the movie at all. Sure, I know there are some who have critiqued the movie's portrayal of Peter Parker, claiming that he is underpowered and made to be the butt end of the joke. There are plenty of critics for Spider-Verse trying to claim that the writers, in an effort to promote diversity, have intentionally shat on the original Spider-Man to do so. Which kinda just tells me that the real reason they don't like it is because they are insecure about being replaced themselves. After all, Peter B. Parker in Spider-Verse is quite possibly the most accurately written Peter Parker that we've ever seen in movies. Peter has always been down on his luck in the comic books, and he has always struggled to maintain his relationships with people. And yet, despite all of the shit that the world hands to him, Peter still manages to push through and do the right thing because he's Spider-Man. Not to mention, the movie isn't about Peter Parker. It's about Miles Morales. And the whole "is he Spider-Man" debate is stupid. Dick Grayson, Tim Drake, Jason Todd, and Damian Wayne are all Robin. Terry McGinnis is Batman. Barry Allen and Wally West are the Flash. Miles Morales is Spider-Man. End of discussion. It's hard to argue with the quality of writing in Spider-Verse unless you are an incredibly insecure person who feels that a black person playing the lead is somehow replacing you or anything that you enjoy. After all, why would anybody be so pressed about whether or not Miles Morales is Spider-Man when Peter and Miles can both be Spider-Man? It's okay to admit that you feel uncomfortable with things like that, but it's not okay to justify those feelings and pretend like they aren't racist. Because the funny thing about people is that we can change for the better, but only if we acknowledge our faults and allow ourselves to do so. I guess I bring up this topic as an example of how some people will attempt to find any reason they can to call someone else's writing bad if the premise, characters, or source material makes them uncomfortable. And yes, it goes both ways. Sometimes racist or bigoted characters in fiction are well written, and it's not problematic to depict bad things in media so long as we are not glorifying or whitewashing those things in the process. No, it does not say something about the author if they make a morally gray character who believes in bigoted ideas but also does good things from time to time. And no, just because the main character of a story and the writer of the story happen to be a woman, that doesn't mean it's a self-insert character. I'm not here to both sides this aspect of the public discussion, though. I definitely lean more towards the left when it comes to things like this. However, I refuse to pretend as if I'm not biased in my own way. Yeah, I do strongly believe in what I'm saying, but I used to strongly believe the complete opposite only a few years ago. The fact is that I like to open my perspective on things as much as I can. And while not every argument can convince me, I can definitely have my mind changed on anything I've said. I don't know if the me 5 years from now is going to view anything in the same way as the me from right now views them. Maybe there's a part of this that I have not considered, or perhaps something that I've missed. Either way, this is generally where I stand for the time being. I think it's pretty easy to spot when criticism is politically charged and when it is more objective and analytical. Politically charged content is a lot more engaging than something more dialectic and neutral. So I can definitely understand why opinions like this will rise and fall a lot quicker than more objective reviews of certain stories. I'm also not immune to having my entire opinion of a story completely changed by a single YouTube video, especially if it's a YouTube video where they make a convincing argument about a show I haven't watched, which both affirms my values and makes me mad at a random external boogeyman. It's happened before, and it likely will continue to happen regardless of whether or not I am aware that it happens. All I can do is take things as they come and review my perspective from time to time. And most of all, I think it's important for me to give myself and other people room to change their minds in the first place. Sure, some people might have a high opinion of a story that I dislike, and their reasonings for those opinions can vary from something I can respect to something that just downright boils my blood. But does any of this ever affect the quality of writing? I think if you've made it this far in the video, you probably know what I'm going to say by now. The quality of writing is completely isolated from the politics or intentions of the one writing it. Perhaps it may affect the personal enjoyment of the people who watch it, and if your goal as a writer is to appeal to a certain group of people, and those people do not like what you've written, then it's time to rework something. But our personal tastes do not always determine whether or not something is actually well written. Our thoughts, feelings, and beliefs do not determine the quality of someone's writing. But if that doesn't, then what does? After all, it might be dismissive to say that those things don't matter in the grand scheme of things. An unpopular work of fiction could simply be ahead of its time, or it could just be poorly written. What's the difference, and how do you spot it? The difference, to me, is whether the critique of a story is meta or not. I should probably explain what I mean by that. A meta critique is not about a story, its characters, or what happens in the plot. It's more about the author, what the characters represent in the reader's mind, and what the reader thinks your intentions are as a writer. And while a meta critique can be useful in some ways, I think it can get confused with objective critiques. In fact, I think the vast majority of negative criticism is aimed towards the meta critiques and not the objective merits of the story itself. Saying, I don't like this story because it is sci-fi and I don't like sci-fi is a meta critique. Saying, I don't like this character because they represent something I don't like about our society and how it functions is a meta critique. Saying, I don't like this character because the actions they take against another character seems out of place for who they are as a person is an objective critique. And to a writer, sometimes a meta critique just isn't useful at all, but an objective critique almost always will be. It's easy to spot whether or not a certain story is disliked because of metacritiques, or because of the objective merits of the story itself. Anytime someone criticizes a show for being too woke, that's a metacritique, and it will likely change with social opinion. Anytime the majority opinion is, this story just doesn't make sense, or the characters and plot are just boring and I don't care, then those are pretty good indications that the story is just shit. The simple fact that we may dislike an author like J.K. Rowling does not mean that suddenly Harry Potter isn't any better or worse than it always was or has been. Perhaps the way we view certain characters or character names and plot threads has changed, but those things have always been there, and they always will be, no matter how much Rowling herself may want to change those things retroactively. Graduation is no less of a great album even if Kanye West is an anti-Semite, but feeling betrayed and bitter about who the artist became is still valid. And when it comes to the conundrum of whether or not it is morally correct to support a morally bankrupt artist if their art is still good, that is a topic too deep to delve into a video for this alone. Regardless, metacritiques can inform us of the current perception of a particular piece of art or story, but it's important to realize that metacritiques can change with the times while objective critiques rarely ever do. I think that's the reason some people will make retrospectives on certain movies or stories which flopped on release, judging those stories on their merits, and not with the context that people had at the time. I think that's why certain stories can feel as if they are ahead of their time, or sometimes we can look back at things that are considered poorly written in their time and realize it's not actually poorly written, only to make the false assumption that writing standards were just higher back in the day, when in reality the story was simply nitpicked by people justifying their meta-critiques with objective critiques that don't really exist, or only exist in a very small way. A modern example of this would probably be Castlevania Nocturn. Now, fair warning, I haven't actually watched Nocturn yet, but I don't feel it's necessary to watch the show to know that it is a good example of what I mean. Basically, people had some issues with the main antagonists of Nocturn, and dislike the fact that it is not Dracula again like it is in the original video games. These people also make the critique that Black characters do not fit in the setting of revolutionary France. And while on the surface these things might seem as if they are objective critiques, they are both meta-critiques. Even if we ignore the underlying internal biases which make people have this opinion in the first place, you're uncomfortable with Black people in media, they are still meta-critiques. We are still criticizing the show because it is not historically accurate, despite the historical accuracy never being a focus for neither the games nor the animated series. We're also criticizing the show for not being canonically consistent with the games, which might be a fair and valid criticism if it wasn't for the fact that the show itself has never fully been a faithful adaptation in the first place. Dracula's arc in the first 2 seasons billed him as less of a monster and more of an anti-villain, a supremely powerful vampire who lost his wife to cruel men, and who comes to realize their fault when they nearly kill their own son in the process of self-destructing. It's a beautiful scene, and puts a fantastic end to Dracula's character, an ending which would be completely undercut if he was brought back, especially since he would need to remain an antagonistic monster, something which he no longer is and should not be reverted to, lest we invalidate all of the character growth that happened before it. It would be worse writing, not better, to bring Dracula back as the main villain for Nocturn, and regardless of whether or not the villains of Nocturn are actually well written, I don't really have an opinion on that because I have not yet watched the show. Still, I know a meta-critique when I see one, and while our feelings on topics are still valid, we should also acknowledge that they are just that, our feelings. Let's not act like they are objective or fair critiques of the story or its merits. We can simply not like something for one reason or another, and just because it might be a popular or unpopular opinion, that does not make it any more or less correct. The truth remains to be true, no matter how many people believe it, and meta-critiques are inherently separated from the truth and steeped in our opinions and views of the world around us. So perhaps if we are always looking in the same places for writing that we enjoy and finding it lacking, then we can believe the illusion that writing as a whole has gotten worse. Likewise, if we have a negativity bias towards what we believe the author's intentions and beliefs are, then we can view the quality of their writing through a much less objective lens. We can pick up on flaws which we otherwise might have ignored if we happen to agree with the author and the message they are writing about, or if whatever they're saying in their writing happens to resonate with us on a personal level. I don't think it's very productive to act as if this is inherently bad or wrong to do either. More so that it is something which happens no matter what we do or what we believe. I think it is productive to make the distinction, however. Might lead to a lot less double standards when we admit that our opinions of certain stories are simply based on our internal biases. I doubt that will happen with everyone, but if you are a critic for any story, I would suggest that you work on recognizing when you are making a meta-critique versus when you are making an objective one. While there are no standards to being a critic, I think that there is a skill to it that needs to be built up and worked on, too. It might help you to come to a more nuanced and thoughtful conclusion about what you've criticized and consumed. As always with these things, I'm not really here to claim that one method is uniquely better or more beneficial than the other. How we choose to consume media is up to us as individuals. And though I may have my personal beliefs regarding this subject, I also acknowledge that those beliefs can be incomplete. Perhaps not every argument made against it will change my mind, but I am open to the discussion about this topic to test what I currently believe. Leave your comments and ponderings down below. But we will never learn how to write better than how we did in the past if we do not take advantage of the present. So either click the video in the corner of the screen right now, or just open up a document, find a project you want to write about, and start writing.